At this time, the National Broadcasting Company presents Morgan Beatty's War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. Morgan Beatty is NBC's veteran war reporter in the British capital. And so, for his regular Sunday report, we take you now to London.
This is Morgan Beatty in London, looking at the 187th week of war through the War Telescope. This has been a week of signs on the horizon, the widening horizon of war. Perhaps the best way to reflect these signs across the Atlantic would be to give you a day out of this reporter's notebook, a typical day of hunting news and signposts of the future in the capital of the British Empire. On the particular morning I have in mind, I drew back the blackout curtains, and below me in the street, a company of British soldiers swung along, throwing out that right arm with a will, and they were singing. They were singing or whistling more often these days, and that's the first sign I have to report. A growing confidence. Maybe Russia's advance last winter, or perhaps Tunisia, had something to do with it. Anyway, you do feel it. It's a definite something in the air. The men were singing that old World War favorite, Tipperary. And I wondered as I ate my rationed breakfast of tea and toast and butter, I wondered why this war had produced no smash favorites like Tipperary or Keep the Home Fires Burning or Over There. My first appointment of the day was with one of those unknown men you can't say much about. The reason is this: they don't carry the responsibility of government on their shoulders, so they cannot tell you the weighty decisions. They may merely give you background, pointers along the way. The pointers I got on this particular day had to do with the world's post-war money and what's going to be done about it. As I reported to you last Monday evening, the United States and Great Britain both have plans for post-war currency, plans based on gold, but they differ in that the United States would lean more heavily on gold, while the British would also use commodity credits, so that non-gold-holding nations could trade more easily with gold-wealthy nations like the United States. Secretary Morgenthau confirmed my report later in the week in Washington, but he did not discuss the immediate money problem that faces the Allies the minute Europe is invaded. Are we going to use the money the Germans are circulating, money adulterated with German promises to pay, but without specific gold backing? Or are we going to print money in Washington or London, special money, and back it with our gold and send that into these countries? Or would it be better to overstamp local currency already in use? That is, put a special stamp on part of the money in circulation and call in or destroy the rest. That might be a way to check inflation. I don't know the answers, and neither did my friend know them. But I doubt if the powers that be have made up their minds completely about it. But once again, my friend impressed me with the complexity of the problems we face. The money problem alone presents angles and obstacles, dark bypasses and dead-end streets where a mistake could mean ruin to the Allied cause just as surely as a major defeat on the battlefield. So no wonder both Churchill and Roosevelt keep warning us to expect setbacks, disappointments, and mistakes. It's not a question of making no mistakes at all. It's a question of how few mistakes we can make. Anyway, the experts are hard at work on the money problem and many another. Both the British and American plans for money will be published soon. This means there's an urgency about it in the minds of our leaders, and that's another signpost of war. Urgency for action in many fields. And so I took leave of the man who knows his money. I decided to cut through a park. Beyond the big gate, I discovered a fairyland of spring blossoms. The bulbs were planted long before the war, and as the British say, they wanted tending. But they persisted in showing their beauty and shedding their perfume. Suddenly, I heard a sound that sent a wave of homesickness over me. Or were my ears playing me false? No, there it was again, a cracking sound that rang like a bell in my ears. Unmistakably, it was the sound of an American baseball bat against a regulation big league baseball. For the first time in years, I really wanted to see an infield swing over when a left-hander came up to bat. I wanted to see a first baseman stretch himself a mile and spear the throw from short. I actually broke into a run toward the crack of the bat, and sure enough, there they were, Uncle Sam's soldiers, warming up for the American baseball season in London. And of all things, scores of British spectators braved the raw wind and looked on fascinated. A burly fellow with a pipe, obviously a cricket or a Rounders fan, spotted me as an American and brought two of his friends over for a chat about the American game. Must the batter always run when he hits the ball, they asked. Yes, unless it's fouled, I said. And what's a foul? I explained the best I could. But how can a foul be a strike? For the first time in my life, I understood how complicated is American baseball, or rather, how complicated it has become through the years with the speed-up rules. I did the best I could to cover the general idea to the man with the pipe, but for the life of me, I couldn't tell him how many feet there are between the pitcher's box and home plate. As an expert, I fizzled out right there. But my English friends liked the game. It looks a good sport, they said, but it wants a lot of knowing, which in American means it's okay, but it's hard to figure out. My old eye for the game returned gradually, however, even though it was distracted a bit by the silver barrage balloons hanging in the sky and the big guns peeping over a parapet of the anti-aircraft defense system. They were a little beyond home run territory. Soon I spotted a professional player, obviously the best man on the field, and I asked him all about his team. He was Chuck Eisen, Lieutenant Chuck Eisen. He confessed he had led both major and minor leagues in strikeouts when he was in the Pacific Coast League in 1941. He went to the Red Sox for $17,000, but before he got a chance to play last year, he went into the Army, and here he is. Chuck says he's going to have the best team in the British Isles, and they'll play in the first World Series in Britain this fall. His boys were out to practice first on March the 6th, to be exact. Chuck's counting on several good boys. At short, he's got Private Johnny Farrell from Brooklyn and Private First Class Bob Korcher of Scranton, Pennsylvania. He may play third base, incidentally. Sergeant Red Summerall of Eden, North Carolina, is shaping up as an outfielder. The only fly in the baseball ointment at this moment is the dearth of uniforms and shoes. Only one team, London-based command, has both uniforms and shoes in this area. The Army has given examples, rather, to a British war contractor, and the men may get their togs by May the 15th, and they may not. Baseball uniforms and shoes must take their chances behind rush war orders, which is another sign of the times. But enough of baseball. My next appointment was pressing close. I took a train for a place which must remain nameless. It's a secret American 8th Air Force bomber station, and there I met one of the rarest people in England, an officer in the American Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WAC. You've heard of her before, perhaps. She arrived 7 weeks ago, and the newsman interviewed her then. She's Lieutenant Dorothy Swart of Elsa, Texas. I asked the lieutenant to come to the studios here in the heart of London today and tell you folks how she likes England and what she thinks of it after 7 weeks. It took a lot of persuading, but here she is, Lieutenant Dorothy Swart, the Dottie to her friends back home before she put on her uniform. She's 5'4", brown eyes, beautiful skin toned by the sunshine of Texas. She's got a contagious grin, and she's every inch an officer and a most desirable dinner companion. She's one of the very few American women soldiers among many men. One of the airmen at the bomber station brought the lieutenant to London tonight, and he's planning to take her to dinner in one of those swank West End spots, I suspect. For coming to London is a rare occasion for the busy people in Bomber Command. Lieutenant, I'm addressing you, young lady, not your escort. Lieutenant, what's your job?
I'm sorry, Mr. Beatty. We can't go very far into that. But I can say I'm in communications. We help supervise the WAC, the Royal Air Force girls on our station.
And how long do you work each day?
We get up at 7:15 and work until our job's finished. Often it's pretty late at night. Then again, we have normal working days.
Then I take it you could use more wax from home.
If they could be spared, we certainly could.
And how do
How do I like England? How many times have I answered that? Here goes. I like England. I'm not homesick. I haven't been bothered much with Brussels sprouts as you have in London because we have army food. And no, I didn't bring near enough stockings. I only brought 12 pair. I could have used 3 times that many. I don't have much time to go out, but when I have gone to dinner, dances in London or another base, I've enjoyed them very much. The English could not be kinder or more considerate if they tried.
Thank you, Lieutenant, for clearing up all the standard points in record time. Now, let's get outside the regular sphere. What do you miss most?
I don't like comparisons, but I do miss good old American sunshine. Next, I miss soap flakes. We have excellent bar soap in England. If you can get a flake, you can't get flakes anywhere. And bar soap is not as easy on our precious stockings. I miss American cosmetics, too. Not because American is better. I really don't know much, don't know which is better. But, because all cosmetics are very hard to get over here. But I'm so busy, I don't have time to worry about things I miss.
But how about those crisp salads and French dressing?
Oh, yes, the salads, too. But if this keeps up, the folks back home will think I'm complaining, and I'm not.
And the things you miss aren't hurting you any, judging from your appearances.
But let me tell you about the fun we have. I've got an English bicycle. It took a little while to get used to the handbrake instead of the coaster brake and riding on the wrong side of the road instead of the right.
The British think the left side is the right side of the road, Lieutenant.
Well, anyway, both sides of the road are the right side for me now. It's still a little confusing.
Tell us, Lieutenant, what's your biggest thrill to date? That dinner dance, the Ritz, or what?
No, not the dinner dance. I deserted that dance so I could be on hand for the great event of my life. A party was given for some airmen, where I could see Mr. Winston Churchill. I hurried from London and arrived just in time to meet one of the greatest men of modern times, the Prime Minister. He looked exactly like his pictures. This was a high point for me because, well, when I saw him and shook hands with the man who has so many responsibilities like our own president, I began to think how hard a job he has. And I thought how wonderful it is in a democracy for the leader to mix socially with the boys who are really fighting in the battles on the front line.
Yes, this must have been an impressive experience for you, Lieutenant. I remember the day I first saw you. You're different somehow in only 7 weeks. You're more mature, more of a soldier, more of a personality capable of carrying on the democracy that Roosevelt and Churchill stand for. Thank you for coming in today. You're another and an inspiring sign of the times for us. As you folks back home may have gathered, a Correspondence Day is a busy one. After my visit to the bomber base, I returned to London to check over the news of recent days. More and more people are being called up for national service of one kind or another. And Brendan Bracken, Britain's skillful Minister of Information, has discovered that the ministry supplied the British people with 40,000 talks last year on every conceivable subject, most of them by experts. But he's going to cut down on talks because the British passion for oratory, as Mr. Bracken puts it, has developed to monstrous proportions, and that's another sign of the times. Less speech and more action. And the Russians are demanding our maximum effort in the near future. Soviet Ambassador Maisky puts it bluntly. We want to bring this terrible war to an end at the earliest opportunity, he said. And that brings us to my major engagement of the day. I talked with a student of war, a man who has spent much of his life studying the history of warfare. That evening, I asked him a question prompted by the Maisky statement. What is the earliest possible opportunity to crush the enemy, I asked? Not the time of it, but the place. My friend of the maps and books prefers the back door of Europe, as he calls it, the Balkans. The same back door the Allies used in 1918. But he reminds me that this war, strategically, is developing several interesting back doors for Allied attack. And would you name them, I asked? He told me to consult the stream of news pouring out of the world. All the clues have been published. Then he smiled. So off I went pondering. After several hours of digging, I discovered what my friend was talking about. Series of developments. These signs began cropping out before the end of March, and they're multiplying fast now. The first one, developed on March the 30th, 4,000 square miles of Britain has been set aside as a possible springboard for offensive operations against the Axis. Then Stockholm reported rumors of mysterious parachuter activity by Allied forces in Norway. Bern, Switzerland said the Germans and Italians are building a Riviera line across the soft underbelly of France. King Boris of Bulgaria has been talking to Hitler about the Balkans, where seething undercurrents are again developing. And General Eisenhower says the Tunisian campaign is shaping toward a decision. And the British United Press today says the Royal Navy is massing in the Mediterranean to prevent a Tunisian Dunkirk. In the midst of all these reports, our own Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, reveals that the United States Navy is working in the Pacific with floating docks, which means we're moving toward independence of shore bases. This is a threat of offensive action against the Japanese on the other side of the world. All of these things add up. They spell opportunity for the Allies on many fronts. At last, the tables are turned strategically, thanks to the back doors of the Axis created by the strategy of the Allied High Command. And now this is Morgan Beatty saying, so long until next Sunday.
You have been listening to War Telescope, a weekly report on the war as seen from London by Morgan Beatty, NBC's veteran war observer in the British capital. Mr. Beatty is presented every Sunday at this same time, so be sure to tune in again a week from now. This program came to you from London and New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
There's more good news from North Africa. Allied armies are threatening both Sousse and Kairouan as Rommel pulls his Axis forces into the northern tip of Tunisia. American bombers have again raided Naples. RAF planes were over southwest Germany last night. And Berlin says the Red Air Force has joined the Allied offensive against the German homeland. In Russia, the Nazis are reported moving up supplies and men for a new summer drive. But for our first report from overseas, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Algiers. Charles Collingwood reporting.
This is Charles Collingwood at Allied Force Headquarters. By now, most of the Axis forces in North Africa have been squeezed into the northeast corner of Tunisia. If there are any German or Italian troops south of Sousse, they are probably in our hands. This battle is moving so fast right now that all our information is miles out of date. But the last we heard, our forces from Fondou were near Kairouan, and the 8th Army was well on the road between Sfax and Sousse. The Germans are moving into the hills of northern Tunisia very fast. They are pausing only to fight isolated rearguard actions and delay minefields. One of the most spectacular sides of this North African war right now is the campaign of American P-38 fighter boys that they're waging against the German transport planes. You know that yesterday they got 40, and a few days ago they got 18. Well, today they got 21 more. The Germans always use their transport planes in a crisis, and this is certainly a crisis now. They are using them to bring over gas and oil and ammunition. But we are taking a terrible toll. With today's 21, we have shot down 79 in the last 6 days. Rommel probably made his decision to pull up his stakes and head for the north as soon as the 8th Army breached the Wadi Akarit. At that time, the big threat to his retreat was the possibility of a successful Allied thrust to the sea, like the one that is now moving from Fondou to Kairouan to Sousse. It's up in the mountainous northeast corner of Tunisia, where something like 200,000 Axis troops must be concentrated now, that the final battle for Tunisia will be fought. The British offensive up there around Medjid el-Bab, which was designed to secure better battle positions for the final drive to Tunis, has made an advance of 10 miles between Medjid el-Bab and Monchar, and between 1,000 and 2,000 prisoners were taken. The concentration of both forces on both sides up in northern Tunisia will be something terrific. All the forces that were stretched out from Tunis to the Maris line have been drawn up into that corner. There is no doubt that the German will be beaten up there, but it's going to take some of the hardest fighting that this war has seen to do it. They are entrenched in those mountains like oysters in their shells, and it's going to be a grim, bloody job to get them out. This is Charles Collingwood in North Africa, returning you to New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Will your radio be capable of tip-top performance 1 year from today? Admiral servicemen all over the country say yes, providing it receives proper care. The words proper care needn't frighten you. Your radio can have the best of care without inconvenience to you or your family. All you need do is make one phone call, nothing else. Phone your Admiral dealer, ask him to check your radio twice a year regularly. He'll then give it the thorough Admiral step-by-step examination by which Admiral dealers anticipate and prevent trouble. One of these steps is a checkup of all tubular and filter condensers, especially of the wax used in their construction. Should this wax melt, as sometimes happens when a set is used continuously, the result may be a defective circuit and a radio out of action. An Admiral dealer, in making regular checkups, will discover such trouble spots early, take measures to correct them. He'll render many other services which will help prolong the life of your radio. If he sees some vital part that needs replacement, he'll order a new one immediately, and despite shortages, probably have it in time to keep your radio in continuous action. Yes, your radio can have the best of care without inconvenience to you. Call your Admiral dealer first thing tomorrow. Ask him to check your radio twice a year regularly. There's only a nominal charge for this service. Now, here once again for Admiral Radio is Doug Edwards.
The vast Russian front remains comparatively quiet again today, but Moscow observers seem to believe that behind that curtain of inactivity, the Germans are preparing for another summer offensive. Reports from the front say the Nazis are wheeling up fresh material in reserves. Red Army planes are said to have destroyed or damaged at least 36 trucks in the last 24 hours. Otherwise, the lull is broken only by occasional artillery exchanges and light patrol activity. The Russians say they've repulsed several minor charges against their Donetsk River bridgeheads. On the Central Front, Soviet forces have consolidated positions 32 to 50 miles from Smolensk. The latest Moscow War Bulletin reports that no important changes took place at any point on the 1,500-mile battle line. However, German planes are also striking at Russian communications. 80 bombers raided a railway station, but dispatches say red planes broke up their formation. The newspaper Pravda reports a great increase in aviation transport traffic, with heavily loaded trains and planes on both sides shuttling supplies and men to the front and carrying away wounded. That's the latest on the fighting in Russia. Admiral Radio had hoped to bring you a report direct from Moscow by Quentin Reynolds, war correspondent for Collier's Magazine. But atmospheric conditions have made the broadcast unintelligible. However, Reynolds has cabled us this report. He says, Moscow is the city where Hitler's dream ended. Someday, historians will immortalize the small suburb of Moscow called Khimka. You can get on a streetcar in front of the Kremlin and be in Khimka within half an hour. It's just another suburb. But Khimka will live forever, because it was here in October of 1941 that Hitler's dream ended. His army was battering at the gates of Moscow then, and one day a German tank penetrated as far as obscure Khimka. That tank and the German soldiers in the tank died, and the Nazi dream of Russian conquest died too. Hitler never was able to get that close to the Kremlin again. I was in Moscow then, and the city was unafraid but grim, and no smiles were seen on the men and women who walked down the streets of Moscow. Moscow was fighting with her back to the wall, and she knew it. But she fought back just as London once fought back, and faith and courage of her sons and daughters were rewarded. Now I've returned to this city of courage. The nearest German is 200 miles away, and Moscow is confident that soon that distance will be increased. Moscow is not overconfident or falsely optimistic, but Moscow is no longer the grim place it was in 1941. Today, the streets are thronged with soldiers on leave. Each night, the opera is crowded with men in uniform and with factory hands. The people of Moscow have been at war now for nearly 2 years, but they are neither weary nor have they weakened. Quentin Reynolds continues, when you come here directly from New York, as I did, it is impossible not to notice the great contrast. A month ago, I was annoyed because sometimes in New York I had to walk a few blocks before getting a taxicab. Here in Moscow, there are no taxicabs, no private cars, and no transportation except streetcars and subway. Mostly we walk. Gasoline, oil, and rubber are too precious to use for anything except war purposes. The dim out in New York annoyed us all a bit. Here in Moscow, there's a complete blackout, and you don't go out at night unless it's absolutely necessary. When I left New York, some people were grumbling because of food rationing. Here in Moscow, you can get 1 slice of butter per day, 1 lump of sugar per meal, and of course steaks, roast beef, and chops, as we know them at home, do not exist. When I left home, people were worrying because whiskey and gin were scarce, and it was difficult to obtain vintage wine. Here in Moscow, one is very lucky to get an occasional glass of vodka. There's nothing else. Moscow is making teetotalers out of even American correspondents. We have a midnight curfew in Moscow. The streets must be kept clear in the event German bombers come. Each of us has 1 electric light bulb in his room, no more. Electric power is needed for war purposes. We seldom have water in Moscow. Power and fuel are needed to run the factories. New York is really not so badly off after all. But no matter what privations, no one here grumbles. Even now, the people at home have a tendency to let the army fight the war. Moscow knows that armies alone can't win wars. Here, every civilian knows that this is his war, and he's doing something about it. Yesterday, I stood on an embankment of the river. Spring has come to Moscow and opened the veins of the river, and the ice has been swept away by the swift current. Here on the embankment was a group of school children, about 50 of them. None was older than 12, and 1/3 of them were girls. They were drilling with wooden guns. A Red Army man marched them up and down the embankment, giving crisp orders, and the youngsters marched smartly and skillfully. These children of Mars drilled for an hour, and when they went hurrying back, not to baseball diamonds or playgrounds. Moscow is at war. Each child has his war job. The report from Quentin Reynolds goes on. I've heard people in New York grumble about the servant problem. Here in Moscow, only the very young and very old can be released for domestic service. Housewives with husbands and sons at the front have to do their own marketing, cooking, and housework, and take care of the babies besides. When school is dismissed and drilling is over, these school kids help. They mind babies. They help with dishes. They run errands. They scrub floors. They're organized into what they call the pioneers, much like our Boy Scouts. They work hard, these children who have no time to play, but they are happy. Each child has heard his mother and father say 100 times, "This is your war, too." And each child makes it his war. Every civilian in Moscow has made it his war. Perhaps New York can learn something about the city of courage. And that's the report from Moscow, cabled to us by Quentin Reynolds. In Britain, Allied bombers and fighters are reported to have been over the enemy-occupied continent today following a heavy attack on Germany last night. For these details and other developments, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS London, John Daly reporting.
The RAF was out last night attacking targets in southwest Germany. Details so far are scanty. The communique reported heavy clouds, which made it impossible to see results. 2 German fighters were destroyed. 18 RAF bombers are missing. It's thought that the RAF force was a large one. Coastal residents heard planes roaring over the coast from midnight to dawn. A climax is near in the French problem. General de Gaulle presided over a 3-hour meeting of the French National Committee today, which was convened to hear General Couture's report. Yesterday, Couture, de Gaulle's representative returned from North Africa, was closeted with de Gaulle in a private conference on the formula for French unity which Couture and Giraud had agreed on. The committee has had nothing official to say about the conference, although a spokesman reported that Couture told the committee that all Frenchmen in North and West Africa were eager to see the establishment of a central and provisional authority as soon as possible. Couture appears to have held the floor for most of the meeting. Evidently, he was impressing on de Gaulle and the committee the urgent necessity of accepting the formula he arrived at with Giraud. The Giraud-Couture plan is the essence of fairness and has the complete backing of the British and American governments. A high-fighting French official has told me that the meeting went well today. But in authoritative quarters here, there is still no disposition to be too optimistic about de Gaulle's reception of the plan. It's hoped that Couture may be able to convince de Gaulle that a refusal to accept the plan will be considered capricious by the British and American governments, and that it cannot but result in the loss of the sympathy of many who have consistently supported the fighting French. It's worth noting that today's London Observer, an independent, middle-of-the-road paper, is very critical of the fighting French attitude. It flatly states that the task of overcoming the obstacles to French unity has not been lessened by the attitude adopted by the fighting French in recent events. It is the first time that an influential London paper has used such strong language in criticizing the fighting French, and it reflects a growing impatience in British circles with de Gaulle's intractability. With all the problems that face the United Nations before the war can be won, it might be well for all of us to pay attention to a notice that was put up on the bulletin board of the Services Club in London's West End last night by an enterprising soldier poet. It said, "The Lord gave us 2 ends to use, one to think with, one to sit with. The war depends on which we choose. Heads we win, tails we lose." Now back to CBS New York and Doug Edwards.
Next, for news on the home front, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Washington, Lee White reporting.
The president had until last midnight to veto the debt limit extension bill, which carries a rider repealing his order limiting salaries to $25,000 a year. Since he failed to do so, the bill is now presumably a law, and the ceiling on salaries is lifted. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, however, the President will issue a statement on the subject and will doubtless explain his reasons for giving in to Congress. Speaking of price ceilings, economic stabilizer Burns told us at the White House on Friday that we might expect an OPA announcement yesterday fixing prices on many food items at levels somewhat lower than those prevailing today. No such announcement was forthcoming yesterday, and it will not be made today either. But an officer of the OPA has just assured me that ceiling prices will be announced sometime in the next few days. The fact that the announcement is being held up, however, may have something to do with the squabble now going on over grade labeling. This, of course, is designed to protect the consumer, to assure him that quality is standard. Since price control went into effect, however, many food processors have found it either necessary or convenient to lower quality in order to make a profit at the prices fixed by the OPA. So far, OPA in some instances has tended to wink at the practice in the belief that it would be powerless to prevent it in any case. But labor has been making an issue of the matter, and OPA has been paying lip service to the proposition that lowering of quality is in violation of the Price Control Act. Here in Washington, it's understood that the President intended to demand grade labeling in his Hold the Line message last Thursday night, but that he struck out all reference to the matter at the insistence of Mr. Brown. This has angered the representatives of labor, and they're now demanding the removal from OPA of certain former advertising men whom they accuse of representing the interests of clients rather than the public. In the last analysis, however, what OPA will do about grade labeling will probably be decided by economic stabilizer Burns, and he's believed to be strongly in favor of enforcement. I return you now to New York and Doug Edwards.
Here in our New York studio is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The British pursuit of Marshal Rommel's beaten Africa Corps continues on a broadening front as the full power of the British Eighth Army deploys in the Tunisian Central Plain. Meanwhile, American, French, and British troops on the German flank are making some progress in the direction of Kairouan, and the British First Army is advancing east of Medjez el Bab. Thus, the Axis forces are caught in a narrowing semicircle. The fall of both Kairouan and the port of Sousse seems imminent, and the great question at this moment is whether the Africa Corps can stop its withdrawal and stand firm on the Enfidaville ridges between Sousse and Tunis, or whether it has gotten altogether out of hand under relentless punishment and is about to be herded to destruction against the sea in the vicinity of Tunis itself. Weighing every known factor, the chances appear about even for this as against Rommel's chance to make a new stand. Montgomery is a master of pursuit, one of the most difficult operations of war, as he has already amply demonstrated. Short of Enfidaville, there are no terrain features favorable for defense, and nothing offering any shelter from the Allied air attacks. The Eighth Army has shown incredible endurance both as to men and machines. The Africa Corps must be suffering not only heavy losses, but severe deterioration of morale. Thus, all the ingredients of rout and dissolution are present. If Rommel can stem this tide, if he can make another stand, he will have well earned the gratitude of his Führer. In that case, the Tunisian battle will become a great siege, with the Allies holding every sort of advantage, but the Germans will have gained more time. If, on the other hand, as is possible but by no means certain, Rommel has lost control of his forces, then it seems likely that within a very few days we shall see a great German disaster in Tunisia, and only the great fortress of Bizerte will be left for systematic reduction by the methodical methods of siege warfare.
General MacArthur reports from Australia that our bombers have made 3 trips over the Jap base at Wewak and its harbor area, shore installation, seaplane base, and airdrome. A 1,000-ton cargo ship was destroyed and 2 others damaged. Wewak is on New Guinea's northeastern coast, about 470 airline miles from our base at Port Moresby and 330 miles northwest of Lae. That's the latest news direct from Australia. For an analysis of the growing air power of the Japanese in that area, here in our New York studio is Columbia's correspondent William J. Dunn, who recently returned from the Southwest Pacific. Mr. Dunn.
You've heard a lot of talk in the past few weeks concerning Japanese concentrations in the chain of islands which front Australia to the north. Increased shipping activity, movement of ground troops, and particularly increased air strength throughout this whole area. The news of the past few days from General MacArthur's headquarters and from Admiral Halsey's South Pacific area seemed to leave little doubt that our Pacific enemies are making progress in the mechanical strengthening of those positions from which any further southward moves must be launched, or which must bear the brunt of any Allied attempt to move northward. Japanese planes in ever-increasing numbers have been reported in the Guadalcanal area, in New Britain, New Ireland, and in the Kandari section of the Dutch East Indies. George Morad, reporting to CBS World News from Australia, says the Japanese have succeeded in establishing a major air base at Wewak on the northern coast of New Guinea, a base which should prove a potent factor in Japan's defense of Leyte Salamo or even Rabaul. Still, there is one point which should not be overlooked in considering the South Pacific picture. There has been nothing in the news of the past week to indicate that the quality of the Japanese air concentration is in any way proportionate to the numerical increase in planes. The 98-plane raid on our shipping in the Guadalcanal area last week can be said to have failed. The news from General MacArthur's area indicates that attempts to divert our repeated attacks on such enemy bases as Wewak, Kaviong, Rabaul, and Madang have been consistently ineffective, and there seems to be every reason to believe that the Japanese pilot operating in the South Pacific today is not the skilled, clever combat flyer we were meeting 6 or 8 months ago. You have often heard that time is the number one requirement of the Japanese in the Pacific today. Time to consolidate far-flung gains, time to replace heavy shipping losses, time to exploit and develop the vast wealth of raw material the Nipponese have won in the past 16 months. It is equally true that the Japanese are sorely in need of time to train Air Corps personnel, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, to replace the heavy losses suffered during their first 6 months of consistent success. American airmen in the Pacific never made the mistake of underestimating the ability of the Japanese flyers they first encountered out there. But they are equally certain that Japan is finding it difficult to train first-class replacements in this all-important arm. Our own pilots out there are asking only that we do not allow Japan the time she wants and requires for the development of an adequate pilot training program.
That was William J. Dunn. Now, here's a message from our sponsor. Salt water plays an important part at Admiral Radio's 2 great plants these days. Much of the radio and electronic equipment now pouring from Admiral assembly lines goes directly into action with the United States Navy. Every device Admiral builds for the Navy must withstand a special saltwater test, undergo a flood of salt water for 200 consecutive hours, 8 days and nights plus 8 hours more. Not only small, delicate parts, but the complete, highly complicated instrument must function perfectly after being subjected to this grueling test. Admiral's peacetime policy, that of producing only the finest in radio, gave Admiral the experience to build such equipment and build it well enough to meet the high standards established by both the Army and Navy. Admiral's peacetime policy also won public confidence, with the result that Admiral became the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. Now, Admiral is using this capacity and experience to serve America's fighting men, to build the radio and electronic equipment they need in coordinating their forces, directing their battles, and winning freedom for the world. The United States this week gives special recognition to the Boys Clubs of America. The Boys Club movement is taking an active part in the biggest job we have today, the winning of the war. More than 500,000 former members are serving in the Army and Navy. Another 250,000, all Boys Club members, are undergoing pre-military training and working as victory volunteers. Our hats are off to the Boys Clubs of America. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's Smart Set. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.
Each Sunday at this time, the National Broadcasting Company presents Morgan Beatty's War Telescope, a review of the war week and a forecast of possible developments to come. Morgan Beatty is NBC's veteran war reporter in the British capital. And so, for his regular Sunday report, we take you now to London.
This is Morgan Beatty in London, looking at the 188th week of war through the War Telescope. As your radios and newspapers have told you, this has been a week of victorious action for the Allies on every battlefront, except perhaps in Russia, where general weather has prevented any changes of importance. This, therefore, was a week that portends a triumphant spring, the first spring in the last 4, dominated by hope. In the words of Britain's Minister of Production this weekend, Oliver Littleton, the spring of our liberation from the horrors and chances of war has begun, and we shall soon be in the high summer of military success. Now, Mr. Littleton is often free with his metaphors, his figures of speech, and he has sometimes in the past been over-optimistic, or perhaps. But events do give him now the benefit of the doubt, and we will overlook his literary flowers. But since the Allies are on the offensive march after all these years of waiting, I thought perhaps you'd like to go back over the last year with me to recall what was happening to us a year ago on the World War battlefronts. Early last April, the men of Bataan were making their last stand. The losing battle against the Japanese in the Philippines was reaching its tragic climax. The enemy tide was running full throughout the Orient. Singapore was gone, and it looked as if the men of the rising sun would soon be ready to take Australia. At home, we were asking ourselves, and it is reasonable and understandable that we were asking ourselves, why the men of Bataan were not relieved, why they got their orders to hold out to the end, why 65,000 or more were finally captured. We didn't quite see, even though we were told, why these men were the price we paid for the time it takes to arm a big nation for modern warfare. Last spring in the Mediterranean, the Axis still held a firm grip on North Africa, and Rommel was even then preparing his daring dash for the Nile Delta and Suez. In this sensational campaign, the German Fox came within an ace of success. The flat green lands of the Nile were almost within sight of the Africa Corps when the British made their last stand. A stand that had to be reinforced, that had to hold. Suez is more of a strategic pawn in war than the Philippines. A year ago at this time, we were all asking ourselves why the British held on at Malta in the face of withering air attacks. We were saying Malta could not last long, and neither could the Nile Delta. But British strategists well knew the importance of Malta. They knew that base in the center of the Mediterranean would one day become a sword in the side of the Axis, as it is at this very moment. The strategists knew that once Allied armies had run the U-boat gauntlet successfully, once they had been trained more thoroughly and more rigorously in the ways of modern war, we would be on the offensive, and Malta would come in very handy indeed, as it has. But of course, we could not be told all this last spring. And again, it's quite understandable that we would not be able to see the picture puzzle of strategy the way it was being fitted together. We were watching the Axis last April, and the Axis was on the offensive. At this same time last year on the Russian front, the great spring quagmires held both the Germans and the Russians in their grip, just as they hold them now. But on the railway lines and on the few good highways, Hitler's armored legions were moving as rapidly as possible toward a new offensive, an offensive that would carry them to a vast trap at Stalingrad, a thrust that was destined to take them almost within sight of the great underground rivers of oil in Russia's Caucasus. Again, we had misjudged the situation, but in a different way. Many of us had thought the Russian winter offensive of 1941, 2 years ago, was really an offensive, whereas the Soviet armies had managed merely to hold on in the clinches and prevent the Germans from preparing an even more powerful punch than the one they finally unlimbered in the Caucasus. During last spring and summer, the Soviet forces backpedaled out of the German trap. The Russian High Command had plans too, it seems, and at the opportune moment, the Red Army staged an almost miraculous comeback. Last winter, they really packed an offensive punch. Their positions were all restored, almost, and Leningrad was relieved. Last April, the great American industrial machine had just rumbled into maximum action toward the seemingly impossible war production goals set by the president. Last spring, England was beginning to double her production through rigid wartime controls of manpower, a program that since has been expanded to use the full strength of British woman power, too. You and I did not see this then as part of a master plan. As a matter of fact, the combined chiefs of staff in London and Washington had only partly worked out their plans for offensive strategy. They did not then know which of the Axis weak points they would strike. It was in June before they fixed upon what our strategy would be and where and when the blow would come. We could not be told all these things then. All we knew was that the Axis seemed to have a stranglehold on our poorly equipped and sometimes badly trained forces. They had us by the throat in the Philippines and in Burma. They were dangerously near the Suez Canal and the Anglo-Persian oil fields beyond. and they were poised for an offensive against the Caucasus around Turkey to the north. Now look at the contrast. The Axis is battling desperately to hold its last tiny bridgehead in North Africa. The Germans' one perch, one bridgehead in Asia in the west, the Kuban area in the Caucasus, is also threatened by the Soviet armies. On the other side of the world, the Japanese have been stopped cold at the doorstep of India and are even now on the defensive in the air. We have pushed them out of Guadalcanal in the Solomons, and the enemy may be on the verge of a decision to get out of New Guinea above Australia before he's pushed out. In short, despite their tremendous strides, which we cannot ignore, it's the Axis that's hanging on in the clinches, trying to hold some of the gains made on both sides of the world. In the European theater, Britain is no longer waked up night after night by the rising and falling wail of the air raid sirens. Although Britain is steeled against a return of the Luftwaffe, at the moment, the sirens sound so seldom that the noise surprises you. In the air, the RAF and the 8th American Air Force are carrying on offensive warfare day and night. Great German industrial plants have been smashed to smithereens time and again. The last series of attacks knocked out the great Krupp works at Essen for 4 solid weeks. But what has made this transformation possible? For it is a transformation. First, of course, we can now see the military principle guiding the Allied High Command. These men know they must not strike without adequate force anywhere in the world. The enemy on both sides of the world must see, by our military action, that defeat in the end is inevitable. Both German leadership and the soldiers in the field, in Tunisia, for example, must be made to understand that only a Dunkirk is possible at best in that theater. When that feeling has saturated the German army, it will communicate itself ultimately to the German people. That feeling of futility is the hampering element in morale against Rommel and his men now. As Oliver Littleton has said, we have made a beginning. We are in the springtime of victory. Even though the road ahead is dangerous, and on it we will find bitter disappointment from time to time. But surely there are other factors in the transformation from last year. Other forces played their part in the turn of the tide. After all, decisions of a high command are merely decisions. They aren't worth the mats they're pinned on unless they're carried out. There are the rest of us, the millions who must carry out the decisions, the commands. There's the regimentation, the rigorous yoke of duty that the British have accepted at the hands of their government. And there's regimentation back home in America. But despite bickering and backsliding, as the Baptists say, there's more and more progress. There are always 2, 3, even more steps forward for every one we slide back. And the people who take these steps, for the most part, are just ordinary men. They're not great leaders, nor yet are they men of military genius. They're men like Sergeant Ben Marcellonis of the 8th Air Force, stationed here in England. But let's go back 10 years for a moment. 10 years ago, Adolf Hitler rode to power in Germany. In the spring of that year, he began to fashion the shackles of Europe and the Germany of the next 1,000 years, as he thought. And about 10 years ago, perhaps in that same spring, a lad named Ben Marcellonis was busy one day in his father's workshop out in Dearborn, Michigan, working on another one of his gadgets. This time it happened to be a diving helmet he was making out of an old hot water tank. Young Ben had, shall we say, borrowed the air compressor hose from his father's filling station. His uncle had given him a hand pump. But Ben reached the height of his local triumph. He became the first youngster to walk underwater at his school swimming pool with the aid of a hot water tank diving helmet. But Ben grew up and went into the army. And he came to England. A year ago, nearly. Ultimately, he found himself at a bomber station. Some weeks ago, Ben was busy as usual, working on the gadgets he loved. Sergeant Green, a combat man, came into his shop. But here's Ben Marcellonis to tell the story. Sergeant, why did Green come in there? What did he want the day he came in?
Well, Sergeant, Green and Tompkins have been talking over designs for a gun mount in the flying fortresses.
But why another gun mount, Sergeant? Haven't the forts got enough guns?
Oh, they have plenty of guns, but the nose didn't seem to have enough protection. And those ME-109s were coming into the blind spot too often.
Oh, I see. So what was wanted was a mount to put a gun on and in the nose, eh?
Yes. You see, it's a pretty tough spot for bracing. Vibration is a problem in gun mounts.
So the combat sergeant wanted you to help him figure out the answers.
Right. He gave me the ideas he and Tompkins worked out, and I got busy. We didn't have any special materials for things like that, so I had to use what I could find around the shop. We had some steel plates and some old solid steel rods, a lot of odds and ends. I cut out the plates for a base and welded the rods on, using barbed wire for welding rods. And then...
No, it couldn't have been that easy, Ben.
Well, no, not exactly. It took about a week. Every time I got a chance, I'd take the gadget into the bomber and make a fitting. I'd bend the leg a little more, or straighten another one. But finally we got her in, and the boys tell me she worked. We had to make some more changes, and I understand the Army has improved on those.
But just a minute, Ben. We're getting ahead of the story. We might just remind the radio audience that you and Green have been singled out to receive the Legion of Merit Award. Not just the regular award, but the officers' class for showing the, shall we say, big shot engineers how to improve the armaments of our flying fortresses.
But we weren't thinking of that. We were just thinking about the bullets coming at the nose of the forts and trying to figure out a way to stop them. And it's a pretty simple gadget. It was a lot easier than tearing up alarm clocks back in Dearborn and making miniature motorboat motors out of them. Honest it was.
That's your story, Ben. But I'll bet your father feels a little better now about all those hacksaws you bent and those cold chisels you dulled with your gadgeteering.
I hope so. I started making gadgets when I was knee-high to a duck. I'm glad one of them turned out to be useful. I used to catch a lot of, well, the old man had to work on me every once in a while when I was a kid. If all this makes him feel any better, I'm mighty glad and proud.
Ben, what's more important is that your dad now knows one of his boys helped out the high command in a tight spot. That's why you're getting an award. There had to be a stopgap, a year of planning and defensive action before the Allies could really get going. In this one theater of war, for example, the British and the American high commands had to go in fast with something. The stopgap answer was a combination of day and night bombing with the Lancasters and Forts and Liberators. What they were really after was heavier, better-armed planes. Planes that could engage and pin down the Luftwaffe. Soon they'll be getting these. Meanwhile, you've provided a heavier firepower for the fortress. It's that heavier firepower that helps the fortresses knock down German fighters at a ratio of 9 to 1. Your gadgeteering turned out to be a stroke of genius, and the Army's making your gun mount standard equipment on bombers. And what you have done has all come about in our year of crisis, the worst year. The skill you acquired, making useless diving helmets in Dearborn 10 years ago, for example, today is shooting down, slowly but surely, Hitler's air power. Hitler should have taken you into account 10 years ago, but he failed to do that, just as he failed to take into account millions like you. Today, Ben, the British government has announced that the United States is now making more than 20 tanks a day for the British Army alone, entirely apart from the tanks we're making for our own Army. Thank you for coming up this afternoon. You're the proof that there are more ways than one for a man to serve his country. As a matter of fact, you may have thought you were merely a cog in a gigantic machine. You are that, of course, but much more, too. You're a vital cog, just as there are hundreds, thousands more vital cogs. Many of these human cogs do not realize how vital they are, as you did not realize it until they told you about your award. But these cogs, these human beings, were the things that made it possible for Oliver Littleton to spread his flowery language yesterday. It made it possible for him to say that the spring of our liberation has begun, and we shall soon be in the high summer of military success. And now this is Morgan Beatty saying so long until next Sunday.
You have been listening to War Telescope, a weekly report on the war as seen from London by Morgan Beatty, NBC's veteran war observer in the British capital. Mr. Beatty is presented every Sunday at this same time, so be sure to tune in again a week from now. This program has come to you from London and New York. This
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battle fronts. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
The North African land front is quiet, but Allied planes are hurling death and destruction on the Axis over a wide area of the Mediterranean. American Lieutenant General Spots reports that his Allied Air Force commands the skies in that battle zone. The Russians are increasing their air attacks on the eastern end of the Axis European fortress, and our own flyers have again bombed Jap targets in the North and South Pacific. Now, for our first overseas report, Admiral Radio takes you direct to CBS Algiers. Charles Collingwood reporting.
This is Charles Collingwood at Allied Force Headquarters in North Africa. There's a lot of air activity going on over what's left of the Tunisian front, but not much else. This is not yet the time for large-scale ground fighting. While the land forces were patrolling the 130 miles of African front yesterday, flying fortresses were going to Palermo and Ferryville and the medium and light bombers were ceaselessly attacking enemy communications. They hit tankers and transports and dry dock and roads and trucks and all of the targets which an air force at the peak of its performance goes after and hits. The story of yesterday's air war sounds very much like the story of any day in the last couple of weeks. Ships and roads and dry docks and a day's score in our favor, 29-8. It's all so much like yesterday or the day before that it's almost boring. But that's the stuff that air superiority is made of, and that's what you get air superiority for, so that every day you can go out and sink the enemy's ships and bomb his roads and strap his troops. That's what a good Air Force does, and what this Air Force in North Africa is doing now. While there is this period of quiet at the front, it might be well to say a word or two about what's going on behind the front. A man I know has just come over from America. He says he was surprised at what he found here. He says he thought all the political difficulties were over. It surprised him to find that they weren't. Well, of course they aren't, although it sometimes seems that they are. The politics of North Africa now are so much less deadly. No one goes around murdering other people or plotting revolutions or trying to seize power. But there still are a lot of people here who want power. Not power here in North Africa, but in France. And that makes the politics that are going on now considerably more scrupulous politics. People talk about the Constitution now and the law of 1870 this and 1870 that. But it is still politics, and it is still true that what is happening here today is going to decide what will happen in France tomorrow. For instance, General Catrou is due back from London almost any day now, and he may have something to add on the matter of the Giraud-de Gaulle agreement. But this is all just conversation now, the sort of thing people say over a dinner table. Because if anything is sure, it is that all this sort of thing is waiting on the settlement of the military problem. The big thing in North Africa right now is to get the Germans out of here. Everything is waiting on that. Other operations, politics, civilian relief, all the rest of it. But right now, it's the final push that everyone is waiting for. It's going to be a rough, sturdy business with lots of casualties. But that's the way it's got to be. This is Charles Collingwood returning you to New York.
More news in just a moment. But first, here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Heat generated by the tubes of a radio makes ventilation imperative. Here's a problem which Admiral engineers faced when Admiral began building radio and electronic equipment for the Army. Radios built for use in the home can be ventilated without considering the question of dust. But radios installed in tanks, jeeps, and scout cars are exposed to clouds of dirt, sandstorms on the desert, all sorts of abrasive particles that could ruin the set's efficiency within a very few minutes. A new means of ventilation had to be found for these radios, one which would keep dust out but allow air to circulate freely. It had to be found at once, not sometime in the future, and it was. Bricks of spun glass now seal the Admiral-built radio and electronic devices which may be subjected to dust, sand, or dirt. There are many problems Admiral is solving. Most of them, along with their solutions, are military secrets. But this one will serve to demonstrate how Admiral, in meeting the almost impossible requirements of war, is condensing years of research into the space of months and weeks. Many of these truly remarkable developments, now being made in producing vital communications equipment for our armed forces, will be found in the post-war radio for all of us to enjoy. More than ever, the Admiral radio of the future will be America's smart set. Now, here once again for Admiral Radio is Doug Edwards.
For developments in the Pacific War Zone, Admiral Radio takes you after a brief pause to CBS Australia. George Murad reporting.
After nearly 4 years of war, Australia came this week to creation of a Food Control Board, or executive. It will handle all domestic and overseas aspects of production, control, and distribution in this great food-producing country. In naming one of his outstanding ministers to the post of controller, Prime Minister Putin said that meat, for example, will be under government authority from the hoof to the family dinner table. It was also hinted that butter and other staple foodstuffs might be rationed soon. It is well known, of course, that during the dark days of 1939 and 40, Australian meat, butter, and eggs literally kept England and some of the colonies alive. Australia did this quite easily, with no noticeable effect on the domestic supply. But now this nation and New Zealand are charged with feeding all Allied troops in the South and Southwest Pacific. Some idea of the amount of food this involves may be gained by the recent Washington announcement that Lend-Lease to America from Australia is larger than our contribution to this country. And it takes a lot of butter and eggs to offset the cost of a bomber, for instance. It is one of the ironies of war. The greatest food-producing countries, America and Australia, have found themselves much less able to figure out food control than other countries such as England, which previously were largely dependent on imports. Here, as in America, much productive time has been lost, and it is hoped now to correct this by a careful system of surveys, production quotas, and inevitably more rationing. The Australian Board will work closely with similar organizations already functioning in New Zealand, Washington, and London. All of this control, this new pinch on the civilians, means that the American doughboy will continue to enjoy what is probably the best diet provided in any theater of war. They eat so well, in fact, that their worries are only of the folks back home. One of my officer friends religiously reads his weekly 1 pound of fat and sends it back to his wife, California. This is George L. Murad in Australia. I return you to CBS.
This is San Francisco. You have just heard a report direct from Australia. And now for analysis of recent events and possible developments in the Pacific Theater, here is William Winter of CBS World News.
Several weeks ago, Secretary Knox said the Pacific was in a state of suspended animation. Today it appears there is less suspension and more animation. The animation is of two kinds, verbal and military. Militarily, there is evidence of increased Japanese air activity in the Southwest Pacific, countered by increased Allied air activity. General Kenney said the other day that the Allies were outnumbered in the air. In point of performance, however, it appears that Allied air power has maintained consistent superiority. This may be due primarily to the superior ability of American pilots and gunners. The Japanese have been concentrating air and ground forces in various islands west of New Guinea and northwest of Australia. From this area, the enemy is in a position to move against Darwin and Cape Talbot in northwest Australia. However, there would be little of immediate strategic value for Japan to gain in northwest Australia since it's largely desert country. It's possible, then, that Japanese concentrations there may be intended as diversionary to distract Allied attention. The Allies, meanwhile, have been building up positions northeast of Australia, that is, on this side, or the east side of New Guinea, in the New Guinea peninsula of Papua and in the Solomons. An Allied offensive would clearly threaten the Japanese naval and air base of Rabaul, which is about 700 miles northwest of Guadalcanal and about 450 miles or so northeast of Buna. Due north of Rabaul is the major Japanese naval base of Truk, from which the Japanese Navy has apparently been operating in the Southwest Pacific lately. If the Allies neutralize Rabaul and eventually Truk, Japan would lose her main naval base in the Southwest Pacific. Without adequate bases, of course, a fleet cannot operate successfully. On the other hand, the Japanese are in a position possibly to move to the east. Japanese leaders have often expressed their intention to cut the lifeline between the United States and Australia. They made one effort in that direction last June when they tried an invasion of Hawaii, but were defeated in the battle off Midway. Recently, there was a Japanese air attack on the island of Canton. Not much damage was done, but the attack may be indicative of how the Japanese mind is working these days. Canton is one of the islands in the U.S.-Australian communications route, about 1,000 miles south of Hawaii and only about 800 miles east of Japanese bases in the Gilbert Islands. There's been much verbal animation concerning the Southwest Pacific. Official statements have been encouraging. President Roosevelt, after the Casablanca Conference, revealed strategic plans for offensive action in the Pacific. Secretary Stimson announced more planes are being sent to the South Pacific. Dr. Herbert Evatt, Australia's envoy to Washington, after a conference at the White House the other day, predicted good news for our side and bad news for Japan before his mission to Washington is ended. What is not known is how long Dr. Evatt plans to remain in Washington. This is William Winter in San Francisco, returning you now to CBS in New York and Doug Edwards.
In Russia, the Red Army has again thrown back Nazi counterattacks in the Caucasus. For this news and other developments, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Moscow. Bill Downs reporting.
One of the best-known women in Moscow today is a lady called Gamilton. She's the favorite topic of conversation in the subways and on the street corners or anywhere you find a group of Russians gathered. It took me several days to discover that when Moscow speaks of Lady Gamilton, they were talking about the lady friend of Britain's famous Lord Nelson, Lady Hamilton. Last week, the motion picture Lady Hamilton opened in Moscow theaters and immediately took the town by storm. It's a mystery to the correspondents here why the ordinary Soviet citizen should take such an avid interest in the last century doings of a woman they never heard of before. But no one here has ever figured out why a none-too-good Hollywood musical and comedy film called The Three Musketeers has been running steadily at some theater in Moscow for over 6 months. Moscow theater goers like American films of any kind. There's an old Lawrence Tibbett film whose Hollywood title I've forgotten, but in Russia it's called Thrilled by You. It's been running over a year and is still doing a big business in the neighborhood theaters. And in the suburban theaters for the past 2 years have been showing the Deanna Durbin film 100 Men and a Girl. These American films are the closest links that the people of the United States have with the Russian people. Sometimes it's a little horrifying.
We regret that atmospheric conditions prevent our bringing you further that report from Moscow. Across the Atlantic, British fighter planes and light bombers continued the offensive against the European continent last night. For the latest developments in this war zone, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS London. Paul Manning reporting.
Stafford Cripps spoke in Bristol this afternoon. It was the usual Sunday speech of a government leader who travels from London to a smaller city and then addresses a university audience. They were interested in post-war planning, in the feeding of Europe, and the men they would elect to Parliament after the war. But Sir Stafford Cripps pointed out, the war must first be won. The hardest fighting lies ahead in Tunisia, and after that comes the invasion of Europe, which will be a hard, difficult job, but not an impossible assignment. Cripps reiterated Churchill's statement that in the Atlantic we are doing only slightly better than holding our own. This touch of realism you find in every speech made these days by British statesmen. They want no one in Britain to forget that only hard work will win this war. But that's not easy to forget in these islands. Everyone is so close to the war here. If you live along the coast, you see British and German airplanes fighting overhead. Today, fighter planes of the Royal Air Force made sweeps across the Channel into France. During one thrust, a British formation was met by German squadrons. In the ensuing dogfight, both sides lost a plane each. And if you live inland, next to, say, a military target, sometimes you get bombed. There have been few bombs lately, of course, but the impact of the war is always there. It seems that so many families in England have lost some member either by a bullet or by capture. I know well an elderly housekeeper who writes daily to her son, a prisoner of war in Germany. When British prisoners were being manacled last October, she inquired of me if I thought this was true. What could I say? I replied that it might be, but it probably sounded much worse than it was. Maybe the Germans were only using light string, and as sort of a political gesture. She felt better after that. And the Americans who are close to the U.S. Air Force here, they never forget the war either. Many of the finest boys in America are here doing battle nearly every day for their country. They go out over Bremen and Vegasack, Saint-Nazaire and Brest. Most of the time they all come back, but sometimes they don't. It's hardest of all to forget that. I return you now to CBS New York and Doug Edwards.
In this country, Democratic and Republican congressmen are nearing agreement on a new tax bill. And as we said before, the Navy has reported new action against the enemy in the North and South Pacific. For details, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington. Bill Costello reporting.
Administration leaders have dropped the deliberate and indeed almost casual manner in which they were handling the tax collection problem. There was a hasty and informal Sunday meeting this morning of key members of the House Ways and Means Committee. and it is generally believed that a new bill will be reported and passed this week, embodying both a withholding tax and at least partial cancellation of 1942 income levies. This sudden disposition to compromise, almost to the point of surrender, is being viewed here against a background of developments in the 78th Congress. The record shows Congress is not satisfied that the executive branch has done everything possible to regulate prices, rationing wages, and manpower. There are now pending at least 6 major pieces of legislation dealing with these subjects: the Pace and Bankhead bills to raise farm prices, the Kildare bill, and the Austin-Wadsworth National Service Act to revise the draft on both the civil and military fronts, and proposals for a civilian supply agency, and the Truman Committee recommendations for extensive changes in the war administrative agencies. Congress has shown by the recent passage of the salary ceiling repealer and the abandonment of the Currency Devaluation Act that it will not hesitate to wipe out the president's discretionary powers, and that it has both the strength and the determination to replace them with definite statutory provisions if necessary. Besides this legislative pressure, the minority party is making skillful use of political pressure, and the Democratic side of the House, in rejecting new tax proposals, has suddenly waked up to find itself for the first time in many years on the unpopular side of an issue. The combination of all these pressures has brought forth in recent days a series of administrative orders designed to appease congressional critics. There was the president's hold the line order, the appointment of Chester Davis as food director, a new draft policy, and then last night's order virtually freezing all war workers in their present jobs. Now it appears that the political high command has decided it must yield some ground on the tax issue or face the threat of a major revolt. Committee members after this morning's meeting merely said they had reached no decision, but were hopeful and would confer again tomorrow with the Speaker and other leaders of both parties. A Navy communique this afternoon tells of a new series of damaging raids against the Japanese. 10 attacks were carried out Thursday against the enemy base at Kiska, and other heavy bombers raided Attu Island as part of the plan to blunt the Japanese spearhead aimed at Alaska. In the Solomons, 3 enemy bombers and 3 fighter planes were shot out of the sky, with a loss of 1 American fighter. And 2 enemy ships were possibly damaged in a raid on the Shortland Island area. Some damage and casualties are reported on Guadalcanal, which was attacked by 2 Japanese planes Thursday night. The Agriculture Department reports today that farmers will probably increase their production of food only 3% instead of the 7% which had been called for. As a result, it is estimated that civilians will get slightly less than expected unless the weather is better than usual. For example, there will probably be only 124 pounds of meat per person this year instead of 138, about 10% less. More food will be produced, but more will be needed for all purposes, and the average consumer may plan for a reducing diet. Now back to CBS New York and Doug Edwards.
Here in our New York studio is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
This is what the Tunisian situation looks like at the moment. Though suffering heavy losses in prisoners and material, Marshal Rommel has succeeded in temporarily stabilizing a front which now forms the left flank of a semicircle of German defenses covering the approaches to Tunis and Bizerte. The right flank of this semicircle rests on the Mediterranean. The left flank, where Rommel holds it, rests on the Gulf of Gabas. This part of the German front is the weakest from the point of view of terrain, that is, this left flank. And it is here that the Germans are confronted by the strongest Allied force, the British 8th Army. Hence, we may expect the next Allied advance to come in this sector. The American troops will probably move up on the left of the 8th Army, and, with some of the French, will take care of the center of the Allied line. And the British First Army and more French will be still farther on the left, next to the Mediterranean. The Allied armies are superior in numbers, material, and in freedom of action. They have the initiative. They have great depth for their air power. They have room to maneuver. They can effect surprise within reasonable limits at any point. But their greatest advantage is undoubtedly their complete air superiority. The Axis now has only some 12 or 15 airfields in Africa. These must not only take care of all air transport operations, they must take care also of the fighter squadrons protecting the transport planes, and of such dive bombers as the enemy may wish to use. Neither fighters nor dive bombers can be operated efficiently over Africa from Sicilian or Sardinian bases. The distances are too great. These Axis airfields are now the targets for almost continuous attack by the planes of Major General Doolittle's Strategic Air Force. Meanwhile, offshore, Allied planes vie with Allied surface warships and submarines in the destruction of Axis shipping. So it is interesting to note that the Axis keeps up determined, if almost hopeless, efforts to get at least a few ships across to their beleaguered troops in Africa.
Today's war news from Moscow centers on increasing activity by the Russian Air Force. Red Army planes are stepping up their attacks upon East Prussia and on German airfields, communications, and troop concentrations. Meyer has bogged down most land fighting, except in the Kuban Delta on the approaches to Novorossiysk. In Hamilton, Bermuda, the British-American Refugee Conference gets underway tomorrow, and it's expected that shipping and immigration handicaps in the rescue of thousands of additional refugees from Nazi oppression in Europe will be among the foremost problems facing the delegates. Now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from our sponsor.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That proverb might have been written especially for radio set owners, since most radio troubles can be prevented if proper precautions are taken. The ounce of prevention many Americans use is the regular twice-a-year checkup given by Admiral dealers. These checkups are made according to a procedure suggested by Admiral engineers and research technicians, a step-by-step examination which enables your Admiral dealer to locate all possible weaknesses in your radio. For instance, does your set have an annoying hum? Well, this may be the result of a circuit made defective by a faulty tube or condenser. If an Admiral dealer finds such trouble spots as he makes his regular checkup, he can correct them quickly before real harm is done. If he sees some vital part which will need a replacement in the near future, he'll order a new one immediately and, in spite of shortages, probably have it in time to keep your set in continuous operation. Only a nominal charge is made for this service. So be sure your radio lasts for the duration. Call your Admiral dealer. Ask him to check your set twice a year regularly. Your Admiral dealer is backed by the entire Admiral organization. In peacetime, the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. If you want action against our enemies, buy war bonds. Buy at least one extra war bond every week for the next 3 weeks. Uncle Sam has got to raise $13 billion in 21 days. It must come from the pocketbooks of America. So let's go, America. An extra war bond every week for 3 weeks. We want action, and money does it. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.
Good evening, everyone. My wire is open for any late word Washington may have on the latest Nazi claim. Berlin Radio claims a U-boat sank our aircraft carrier Ranger. Not a word has come out of Washington regarding it up to half a minute ago. It remains an absolutely unconfirmed enemy claim. Germany, you remember, once claimed it sank our aircraft carrier Wasp, and it proved to be a lie. Germany claimed she sank our battleship Maryland off Brazil. It proved to be a British freighter and another Nazi lie. She claimed her U-boat sank an American cruiser off Norway, and that proved to be a lie. The Ranger is a 14,000-ton ship. She's said to normally carry 1,800 men and 80 planes. Hitler may be trying to mar our Easter holiday with some psychological warfare. Here's some news from Tunisia, late news. Another part of Rommel's army may be outflanked tonight. That famous hill known as 648, where there was such bitter fighting earlier in the Tunisian campaign, has been captured by French troops. It's 10 miles southwest of Pont-du-Pont. That's Rommel's last defense line outside Tunis. Nazi propaganda will try hard now to call it von Arnhem's battle, in order to persuade us to forget it's Rommel's defeat. But I'll keep reminding you. The handwriting is on the rocky wall outside Tunis tonight. The final breakthrough by General Alexander's army may come at any time. He's cracking Rommel's most powerful line only a few miles outside Tunis. If Anderson's men make it, Tunis may be done for. Hitler would have nothing to show for his 2,000 miles in Africa except Bizet. One surprise report from Tunisia concerns Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of our most brilliant commanders, in charge of all ground operations and stationed in Washington. He was on inspection in Tunisia and wounded Friday. His injury is said to be serious, but his chance of recovery is said to be fair. He's 59 years old. Lieutenant General Ben Lear has been called to Washington for temporary command in McNair's post. Here's one headline Hitler never expected. Allied armies are advancing tonight on the entire Tunisian front, on a front 140 miles wide. Montgomery's initial advance at Alamein, you remember, was only 5 miles wide. By that much, have Allied troops hammered Rommel's men deeper into Coffin Corner. And here's another surprise for Hitler. General Giraud was a Nazi prisoner last October. Tonight, his army of 60,000 Frenchmen holds every mile of yesterday's 12-mile advance and drives to within 24 miles of Tunis itself. And a little over 200 days ago, General Montgomery fought to hold his last remaining 40 miles to Alexandria. Tonight, Rommel has had to abandon his troops. He's said to be building a new defense line in Sicily. And Montgomery is almost close enough to open his heavy guns on Tunis itself. We've heard a good deal about casualties, ladies and gentlemen, and we shall hear more. We were warned many times to expect heavy casualties in Tunisia. We've had some official figures. Any casualty is heavy for the family to whose home it comes. But our total figure is not considered excessive by any means. Other men coming out of Africa say the full casualties have not been reported. Washington replies all available figures have been given. Any claim to the contrary is said to be based on a misunderstanding. We ought to make desperately sure casualty figures do not become a matter for speculation, rumor, whisper, or contradiction. Surely it's too solemn a matter for that. It was bad enough to have it on such items as rubber, food, or gasoline. Now the matter of shipping losses leaves us puzzled as one government bureau declares firmly, we built more ships than were lost last year. In another bureau, a Senate committee claims we lost more than we built. When I add all the raging charge and countercharge on rubber production between Mr. Jeffers and the War Department, you can't help but feel sorry for any man trying to figure it out. We ought to make certain we keep our casualty figures out of any such debate, speculation, rumor, or contradiction. I think we ought to make it a hard and fast rule to confine all discussion of casualties to official figures. I can recall 5 or 6 times when we were warned casualties would be heavy. It seemed to me many a man must have asked himself as he heard it, I wonder why it's being emphasized so much. Are we being conditioned for some bad news? Are the casualties so heavy that we're being prepared for a shock by this constant emphasis and reiteration? I'm sure that was not our purpose. It was simply that Tunisia was far away, Rommel was on the run. Many people were saying it's all over before it was over. Official Washington knew how much hard fighting waited ahead. It was necessary to remind us of it, and emphasis on casualties was our reminder. But when it's overemphasized, when it plays on our nerves night and day, when we get one report in Washington and other reports are brought out by men coming out of Tunisia, why then you get doubt, whisper, rumor, and confusion. I say it was bad enough on rubber and gasoline. Surely we'll keep anything as sacred as casualties out of any field of debate or contradiction or even misunderstanding. Our job is to make war on the enemy's nerves and not our own. Seems to me instead of emphasizing casualties which are yet to come, we ought to emphasize all the care and preparations we've made to keep our casualties as low as possible. We ought to make it plain casualty figures include a great many men who are missing or taken prisoner or wounded. We ought to hear more about all the brilliant work our medical men are doing and how much new scientific knowledge is doing to save life and limb even after a man has been wounded. Surely we owe that to millions who are holding a long vigil here at home. Yes, there will be casualties. And there will be miracle-like healing and reunion, too. Hitler and Tojo combined failed to cut down New York's Easter parade today. 750,000 persons turned out in what experts call the most colorful Easter parade in Manhattan's history. Tomorrow we'll see the photographs of coming fashions for the ladies. Well, for a man, a face sparkling fresh is all good fashion, isn't it? A man can't possibly ask for a better calling card than a face sparkling fresh. And Barbasol does leave your face sparkling fresh every time, for it's shaving at its best. Not just occasionally, but 10 times in 10, 100 times in every 100. Union leaders representing 50,000 men talk of walking out next week unless a new contract is agreed upon. John Lewis is said to be in New York and gives no indication of going before the World Labor Board. And here's a suggestion respectfully offered to congressmen who are home for Easter vacation. Drop in on Mr. X, who lives in your town, Mr. Congressman. You'll recognize his home by the flag in his window, a flag and a star, perhaps two. Ask to meet Mrs. X. Ask her what people are talking about. And she'll probably tell you they're talking about prices, the cost of food. Ask her how she manages, and she'll probably reply, heaven alone knows. For you see, Mr. Congressman, Mr. X is one of millions of Americans whose salaries are where they were 2, 3, 4, 5, and 10, and 20 years ago, whose cost of living has gone up shockingly high. Mr. and Mrs. X and their children, for whom the war has meant only pain and difficulty and a day and night struggle to keep afloat. Mr. and Mrs. X, who've had no wartime wages, no wartime profits. America's forgotten family, forced to give up more and more things every day and just hang grimly on. Mr. Congressman, when you get back to Washington, you'll be asked to vote for a withholding tax to check inflation. It's due May 3rd, according to reports tonight. A tax to hold back at least a part of billions of excess dollars people are pouring out in a mad rush to buy things. Can you vote an anti-inflation tax against Mr. X? Are there any excess dollars at his home? Is he helping to cause any inflation? Can he possibly stand a reduction of another penny in his present tight fix, let alone 20%? He'll give you his last dollar for liberty. He gave his boy. He's giving anything and everything his country calls for. His people have been in every front line whenever America calls. How are we going to tax a man against inflation when actually he's so badly deflated by higher living costs he can't possibly get by now? Gentlemen of Congress, are we going to pass a blanket withholding tax? Are we going to deduct 20% of all salaries, treating alike cases where income may have gone up 2 and 3 times as much as it was a year or 2 years ago, and others where it hasn't gone up $1 in years? Homes where a head of lettuce is becoming a rarity, where the common, lowly, everyday vegetables cost enough to be locked in a vault, where meat is only a memory. I heard of a school teacher recently in a small American town who went to a bank to cash her salary check. Can I have it in new money, please, she asked. The teller behind the window smiled. Afraid of germs? Mister, she replied, a germ could never live on what my salary will buy at present prices. Ladies and gentlemen, Marshal Dane.
Thank you, Gabriel Dieter. Men, did your face sting or did it sing after your shave this morning? If you weren't completely satisfied, get yourself some famous Barbasol shaving cream.